we have got to stop this insane search for extraterrestrial life. Think about it. Think about it. If we find an extraterrestrial life form, there's a 50-50 chance that it will eat us. It's either or, is it not? And then you think of the number of possible life forms out there, and the odds get worse and worse and worse. This has to stop. We're going to talk today about what I call the virtue of black and white thinking. And it's the use of the idea of either or, what's called the excluded middle in logic. And it gets a bad rap. It gets a bad rap for good reasons, because people abuse it, and it usually comes, the abuse that is, usually comes in the form of false alternatives, and you've heard them all, and maybe not all the same ones that I've heard, but we're all familiar with them. You're either conservative or a liberal. You're either a Democrat or a Republican. You're either a religionist or a bright, as some of the new atheists used to put it. You're either brilliant or you're a moron. But these are not instances of black and white thinking. These are false alternatives. Yes, conservatives and liberals are different. Yes, religious people and non-religious people are different. Although that's a formulation right there, religious and non-religious, that you should make a marker on. So there's all sorts of false alternatives out there. And there's a big difference between religious and non-religious and saying religious and bright. And we're going to look at that difference in several ways, and then we're going to turn to a tool that I think is really helpful in figuring out exactly what black and white thinking properly is, and to see how it can help us to think more clearly, keep our ideas connected to reality so that they're efficacious and can serve our life and flourishing in reality. So, what we were just hearing, these false alternatives, are what are called in logic contraries. They're different. Conservatives are contrary to liberals and the like. But there's a different way of dividing alternatives, and that is by dividing them in terms of what is called contradictories. A contradictory is just sort of a fancy name for putting it in the form of A versus non-A. So A or non-A, right? You're either religious or you're not religious. That's very different than you're either religious or you're a bright. And contradictories are really, really helpful in thinking about what's true and false, because something is either true or it's not true. It goes right to the core, right there, and you can hear it pretty quickly. So I want to explore some contradictories and some of the ideas surrounding contradictories. And then we're going to do a bit of a workshop, actually, and I'm going to get a lot of audience participation today once we put this tool on the table. But let's first get our head really around what it means to be a contradictory and what the law of excluded middle is. So in my first talk, I made a big deal of the law of causality. And if you recall, I said that the law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. The law of identity is the idea that A is A. A thing is what it is. A rose is a rose. The law of causality says, yes, because the rose has an identity, because it is what it is, it must act in accordance with its identity, and it can act only in accordance with its identity. A rose can bloom, it cannot speak. If a rose were here, it could not understand what I'm saying, but it can wilt. So it has the properties that it has. That's the law of causality. The law of non-contradiction, which is sometimes called the law of contradiction, which sounds very contradictory, is the idea. It's basically the law of identity put in negative form to help us think. So it's the idea that a thing cannot be both A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. So a rose cannot be both a rose and a non-rose in the same time at the same respect. So you could take a rose and then you could burn it. Yep, I'm going to turn this off. All right. All right. Apparently this is the thing I've got to use. Can you hear me in the back? All right. So you could take a rose, and it's a rose, and then you can burn it, and now it's the same stuff, but it's no longer a rose. It's a rose in a different respect. It's the dust of a rose. Or you could have a thing that's a rose at one time, and then later it's not a rose. So that's at the same time and in the same respect. These are really important laws because they're the basic laws of thinking and understanding what's true in the world. The law of excluded middle is yet another law. This is the fourth of these, and it is the law of identity in the form of either or. A thing is either A or non-A. So a thing is either a rose, a flower is either a rose or it's not a rose. And if it's not a rose, then we have a definitive statement about that. Now, the power of this law, the law of excluded middle, beyond botany, which isn't going to get us very far, it's pretty impressive if you think about it. I'll throw some things out there. So if you're familiar at all with Ayn Rand's derivation of life as the standard of value, she induced the principle that human life is the standard of moral value and that life for any given living thing is its standard of value. How did she induce that? She began by asking the question, do we need morality? And if so, why? Because if we don't need morality, then we don't need it. We can throw it out, get on with our business. Either we need it or we don't. If we do, then the reasons why we need it, the facts of reality that give rise to the need of it, to put it another way, are going to shed a whole lot of light on what constitutes a proper morality. And this is how Rand started her inquiry into what is the essence of true morality. That's a pretty big lever. And it's the law of excluded middle that got this underway. Likewise, for much of what Rand did in epistemology, either we need a given concept or we don't. If we do need it, then the facts that give rise to the need of it are going to tell us what that thing refers to, those facts. If we don't need it, then the absence of need is going to demonstrate that it's not connected to reality. It doesn't have a referent. It's not a valid concept. Take extremism, which she made a big deal of in an essay titled Extremism, the Art of Smearing. So this word, extremism, is used all the time, and it's illegitimate completely. Because what is going on with it? It says it has a negative connotation. It's always a negative connotation. Nobody's called an extremist like that's a good thing. So it carries a negative connotation. And with that negative connotation, it's blended with the idea of going to extremes. Well, is it bad to go to extremes? Should we moderate our justice, or should we be extremely just? Should we moderate the degree of racism in which we engage, or should we get rid of racism and just not be racist at all? It doesn't make any sense to say extremism is bad. That's like saying a lotism is bad. So the question, do we need this concept or not, either we do or we don't, law of excluded middle, is very powerful. It's a really, really powerful tool. Either a given law protects individual rights or it does not. It either serves to ban the initiation of physical force or fraud or extortion or the like from social relationships so that we can act on our own judgment and live freely and thrive as human beings, or it doesn't do that thing. And if it doesn't do that thing, then it's not a legitimate law. The whole purpose of law, legitimately, is to free people so that they can act on their judgment and live and thrive. Produce things, trade things with other people, not engage with people they don't want to engage with those who will voluntarily engage with them, and so forth. This is what we have to do in order to live. And the law of excluded middle plays a major role in understanding how to apply that principle. Either a given law upholds that principle or it does not. On the personal level, either a personal habit of yours is serving your life, helping you to flourish, or it's not. It's either or. If that personal habit, let's say you're getting up every morning and doing a workout and it's really good for you, that's a good thing. Let's say you're spending way too much time on the internet and you know that, and it's precluding you from doing things that would make your life wonderful. Either this is a good habit or it's not, and you are in control of your mental processes, as we talked about a few days ago, so you can do something about that. So this either-or mechanism is, I think, something that we can really leverage, and I want to talk about how to leverage that. If we combine the law of excluded middle with principles, specifically with principles, we get a really interesting tool that I call principle as plateau. And I'm going to give some examples of how this works and the meaning of this, and then I'm going to start getting some data from you guys that we're going to plug into this, in effect, and see what happens when we put this thing to work. Before we do that, though, we need to get clear on what a principle is. And that's a pretty big subject, but I'm going to give, I think, a simplified indication that I think everybody can get their head around. So a principle is a fundamental generalization to guide our thinking. A fundamental generalization to guide our thinking. Now, this is a very broad, generic definition of principle. So, for instance, God's word is the moral law. You must obey God's word to be moral. That is a principle. It's a principle of religion, certain religions. And religious people who embrace that principle use it to try to guide their thinking and then their actions. Being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. That is the principle of altruism. And people who think that that is true try to some extent to act that way. They instead of going and doing the things that they want, whether skiing or building a business or whatever, they might go serve soup to people in a homeless shelter when that's not really what they want to do to make their lives great. So it's a sacrifice. It's self-sacrificial service. This doesn't mean that there's no such thing as non-self-sacrificial service of that kind. If it's in your hierarchy of values and you really want to do that and it helps to make your life great, that's a different story. But the idea that it's the correct thing to do and then you're doing it because it's allegedly the moral thing to do rather than because it's going to help you to flourish, that is the principle of altruism, and it's a principle. Being moral consists in thinking for yourself, pursuing your own life-serving values, and respecting the rights of others to do the same. That's a principle. It's a principle of egoism. It's the idea that basically Rand's idea, which is the centerpiece of her philosophy of objectivism. You should use your mind, produce values. You should go after the things that will make your life great. Don't give up greater values for the sake of lesser values. and then respect other people's rights to do that so they can be productive and we can all trade and flourish. I think that's a great principle, but it's just another principle among principles here at this point. Faith is a means of knowledge. Faith is a means of knowledge. It's a principle. Some people go by this. They say, yes, it is. If I have faith in something, then I know it to be true. This indeed is the exact principle that the jihadists who beheaded Theo van Gogh, what we heard about from Ayaan Hirsi Ali, were acting on. They had faith that Allah exists and that Allah wanted them to, not wanted, insisted that they behead this infidel, and so they did. And on the premise that faith is a means of knowledge, they couldn't have been wrong. It's actually impossible that they were wrong. If faith is a means of knowledge, it's a means of knowledge. If they had faith they should do it, they knew they should do it. You see the importance of principles and getting them right. By the way, that's the same reason that jihadists flew the jets into the skyscrapers on 9/11. Reason is man's only means of knowledge. Different principle. You get the idea. So there are principles and they're generalizations to guide our thinking. The idea that reason is man's only means of knowledge is a principle that tells you, hey, if you want to figure out what's true, you have to activate your mind. You have to use your rational faculty. That's what it's for. That's what it does. Now, I want to narrow it to the difference between principles in general, including all of the ones I just named, and what is a valid principle. Well, a valid principle is a fundamental truth to guide your thinking and your choices and actions. It's not just a generalization, it's a true generalization. It's a generalization that you can or have proven, or that somebody has proven. And some examples of those would be these. And these are the things that we're going to plug in to this tool. Engaging your rational faculty to guide your thoughts, choices, and actions is good for your life. Now, I'm putting these in very straightforward terminology. You could probably improve some of these, but they'll do for today. Another one, think about that. So engaging your rational faculty is good for your life. Well, think about that just on a personal level in regard to diet and health, just physical things. If you don't engage your rational faculty and figure out what's good for you and act accordingly, you're going to perhaps eat really poor food, get yourself into really poor health, perhaps die young, certainly not live the same kind of robust, energetic life that you could have. Pretty clear that there's a big difference there. Likewise for working out. If you're not exercising at all, and you know that that's the case, and you see that you can exercise, your rational faculty should tell you, hey, let's do some exercise. It's good for my life. So the pro-life approach, it's if you want to live and flourish, but all moral principles are presupposing that. So that's the general idea of that principle. Here's another one. Pretending that facts are other than they are is bad for your life. We got a really, really powerful indication of this one this morning from Amala. Before she started thinking for herself, she was pretending to herself that she knew that these leftist principles and ideas were true. She was just out there, that's what she said. I was just out there saying it. I didn't even know what I was talking about. That's pretense. That's dishonesty. It's not good for your life. And kudos to her for seeing that that's what was going on. And damn any adults that were involved in pushing her in that direction. But in the direction of doing that kind of work when she was at that age. But you see the significance of this principle. I guess pretending the facts are other than they are is really bad for your life. Reality is the realm of values. You don't want your mind to be severed from that in some way. You don't have floating abstractions like, oh yeah, this is right, when you have no idea whether it's right, what connects it to reality. That's a bad thing for your life. Another one, judging people according to the facts and treating them accordingly as they deserve to be treated. That's good for your life. Any entrepreneurs in here? Or employers? Yeah. What happens if you partner with someone who is dishonest? That is not going to end well, right? What happens if you hire employees who are lazy or not into the job that they have and aren't going to put in their all? Your business suffers, right? What happens when you hire stellar employees? I've hired some of those. I know what happens when you hire stellar employees. They really help to grow your business and to achieve your mission. So judging people properly, according to the facts, and treating them accordingly is really, really important. Establishing the relative order of the values in your life and then pursuing them accordingly. Ayn Rand made a big deal of this. Establishing the relative importance of the values in your life and then pursuing them accordingly. So if you're in college and you have a degree in mind and you're really struggling to get that degree because you want to go on to be a doctor or a botanist or whatever it is you want to do, and you have other things that you love dancing, you love partying with your friends sometimes, you like skiing. Well, you've got to organize these things according to their relative importance to your long-term happiness and success, and then pursue the values accordingly. If you don't, if you just, oh, yeah, well, school's important, I like that, and I do want to be a botanist, but then you're off skiing every weekend and not doing the studying that you need to do, what happens to your life, right? So organizing your values in accordance with their hierarchy is a crucial life-serving tool. And it's a principle of good living that you need to do this. So let's plug some of these in. There's one more. I'll just say it real quick, and then we're going to plug some of these in and see what happens. The only proper purpose of government is to protect individual rights by banning physical force from social relationships. Now, for the exercise that we're going to do here, by the way, you don't even have to agree with these principles, because the point of today is not for me to tell you what's true. It's for me to show you this tool. And then we can talk some in the Q&A about how do you determine which principles are actually true. That's a big and a whole different subject, and we teach courses on that at OSI. But for today, it really doesn't matter whether you agree with the principle. What I want to do here is talk about how to use this tool and the value of it in thinking about these kinds of principles. So we're going to take one at a time. We'll start with our first one, engaging your rational faculty to guide your choices. So that is a principle. And what I think about here is that when you place that up there, and it's too many words to place up there, so we're just going to sort of conceptually place it up there. When you place the principle of rationality up there, we'll call it, what you have is the moral high ground. This is how you should act if you want to live and prosper. That's what it is. The excluded middle is, it's either you're doing that, whatever action you take is either doing that or it's not. Either or. If you're not doing that, there's the question of degree. To what extent are you not doing that? And you can think about it like this. The moral high ground is pure. It doesn't say you won't make mistakes. It says that your effort genuinely is to try to maintain that. You might err. We err all the time. Errors are not the same things as breaches of morality. So that's not what we're talking about here. But you make an effort to always go by your rational judgment. That's a personal policy. It's a principle. Maintaining that is really good for your life. Doesn't mean that emotions aren't important. They are. We talked about this the other day. They're your psychological means of experiencing your values. If you didn't have emotions, there'd be no point in using your rational faculty, because there'd be no point in living. But reason is your means of knowledge, so it's the thing you need to use to guide you in life by taking even into account your emotions. Yes, I'm feeling this way. What does my reasoning mind say I should do given that and the other surrounding circumstances? So that's the relationship there. If you cease to be fully principled about reason, and occasionally you act irrationally, or you let your emotions take over, Nobody in the sky is going to come down with a bolt of lightning and kill you. That's not how reality works. There are some fantasies to that effect, but that's not the way it really works. The way it really works is you harm your life a little bit if you do that a little bit. It's just not good for you. It's not a good thing to do because it's not good for your life. So, and the only punishment is that it harms your life a little bit. But there's no reason to harm your life a little bit, right? So staying in the moral high ground is a really good thing to do. Now, if you sort of get aggressive about not using your judgment, either in the form of, we talked the other day about the difference between drift and evasion, right? If you drift a lot, like you just kind of let yourself go into auto mode, so you're just acting on your emotions, and you do that more and more, you get further down that slope, and what happens to your life accordingly? You're now not using your rational mind to guide your life. You might start doing things like drinking too much, not working out, eating poorly, not treating your friends as they deserve to be treated, so you lose some friendships. All sorts of bad things can happen because your rational faculty is not in control. And you can do worse. Instead of drifting more and more and more, you can make a greater and greater effort not to know something, right? That's evasion. And if you do that, it's super bad for your life. If you pretend, for instance, that you don't know that you've gotten terribly out of shape when you do, you're not going to have any incentive to get yourself in shape. If you pretend that you're not having a pain in your chest when you are, you could kill yourself, in short order. So it's just really bad to do that. So you see how this model works. All right, we're going to move on to a couple of other examples, and then I'm going to get some examples from you guys that we can plug into this. So pretending that facts are other than they are, we basically just covered that. I'll move on to the next one. Judging people accordingly. Judging people according to the facts and treating them as they deserve to be treated. If you do that as a matter of course, you will have better business relationships, better friendships. This doesn't mean that some things won't go south. Judging people is really hard, right? And things can go south even when somebody doesn't do something wrong. You can have a business relationship break up for perfectly honest reasons on both sides, so I don't want to say that. But in the aggregate, if you make a principle of judging people according to the facts and treating them as they deserve to be treated, your life gets better, right? Or stays good if you're already doing that, right? You have better business relationship, better friendships, better romantic relationships. You elect better politicians because you're judging them accordingly. Everything's better. It's a good thing to do. The principle is a principle precisely because it's life-serving. If you dip into the slope a little bit, that's a little bad for your life. If you go way down the slope, it's really bad for your life. But there's a sense in which stepping over that line at all is really bad. Because stepping over that line means that you're willing to do that. It sets a precedent. It says it's okay to step over the line sometimes. But stepping over the line isn't good for your life. So this is, again, why I think it's good to be able to think about these things in just with crystal clarity about the either-or nature of a principle. Establishing the relative importance of your values and then acting in accordance with that hierarchy. Fascinating thing that Ayn points out in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Of all the places that she points out an ethical principle, kind of shows how her philosophy is very integrated. She says that if you don't organize your values hierarchically, that you literally cannot make value calculations. A value calculation is made with respect to the order of importance of your values. If you haven't organized them in any order, if it's just skiing is good, partying is good, sipping a Mai Tai on the beach is good, studying, that's good too. If they're all equal, then you can't say, hey, what's the most important thing for me to be doing now? If you hierarchize them, you say, I really want to start this business. That's my central aim right now in my life. Or let's say you've already started a business and you're really working on a relationship. You're like, the business is great, but I really need to focus on this relationship. That's at this point in my life, my hierarchy, or the top of my hierarchy. Whatever the case may be, there's no dogma that's, again, there's no guy in the sky that's going to tell you your hierarchy should be this. You have to choose your hierarchy by thinking about your life. And then once you do, then with that hierarchy, with your values organized, you can start making value calculations. Oh, it'd be better to go skiing next weekend, and that way I can study this weekend. So this is a really important thing. Well, you're either doing that, you've either done it and you're maintaining it, or you're going to start doing it, which puts you up there as soon as you start, by the way, or you haven't. And if you haven't, then you're somewhere on that slope, whether by intention or not, because you can't make the value calculations that would make your life great if you were not on that slope, if you were up on that high ground. Now I'm going to give just 2 more examples, and then we're going to turn to you guys to push in some additional examples here. It's really important that when you use principled thinking, that you define your principle correctly. If you don't, things go really foul. So the principle of honesty, according to the objectivist ethics, and according to reality, as far as I can tell, is that you should never pretend that facts are other than they are in the full context of your knowledge. Never pretend that facts are other than they are, given all that you know. But if you instead put up there, you should never lie, if you use that as the principle of honesty, you run into all sorts of problems. Let's say a burglar comes to your house and he gets in, he finds you, and he puts a gun, he says, do you have any safes in the house? And let's say you have a safe upstairs behind a painting. Well, you have to tell him the truth. Never tell a lie. That's a horrible principle. That's not a good formulation of the principle of honesty. Principle of honesty, the properly defined, says never pretend that facts are other than you are. Who is pretending in the scenario with the robber? He's the one pretending. He's pretending that your money belongs to him. It doesn't belong to him. When you lie to him to protect your legitimate value from his pretense, that's not dishonest. It's precisely an act of honesty. You're taking the full context into account. He's ignoring most of the context in the world. Like, it's just, the whole thing is pretense on his end. So you have to, the importance of formulating your moral principles in accordance with the actual facts of reality can't be overstated. If you get that wrong, then this kind of thinking is more dangerous than it is good for you. So again, if you ever want to take courses on this topic, and I'll give some suggestions at the end of this about some reading you can do from Ayn Rand and some others on this subject, but it's very important that you get the formulations correct. If you do get them correct, like, forming life-serving habits is good for your life and breaking, life-thwarting habits is bad for your life, or life-throttling habits, then, that tool works really well. So the key is to identify the principle that governs the sphere you're thinking about, health or friendships, relationships or whatever. Get it onto the moral high ground as the thing you need to do in order to live. Know why it's true. You don't want to just, this isn't religion. It's not, they came down from the mountain on stone. You have to understand where they came from. So the importance of philosophy comes in here. This is philosophy. You're figuring out what are the true facts about reality that we live in, so that we can thrive in this place. That's what this science properly is for. And so once you know why and you define it properly, and then you can put this tool to work. You can put any valid principle up there. You have to go to politics. So the proper purpose of government is to protect rights. All right. Which governments in the world today protect rights, and do not violate them. Could we put any at the top in that moral high ground? Zero. That's a tragedy, but this tool can even help us there. If you started going down that slope, what would be at the very bottom? What countries would be down toward the bottom today? Yeah, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran. You could start, and then you could start working your way up, and you'd get, eventually toward the top, you'd get to the more westernized, civilized societies like Canada, the United States, Norway, et cetera. And you could go through this and determine, in effect, a rough indication of where the different states belong based on the extent to which they protect rights versus the extent to which they violate rights. So it's a really good, I think it's just a super helpful tool. Now, what I'd like to do with the remaining, maybe for about 10 minutes, because I want to leave some time for Q&A as well, is throw an idea, a topic or a subject. It can be racism, it could be abortion, it could be immigration, anything, or something at the personal level, friendship, developing friendships, whatever. Throw some stuff at me, and we'll think about how to get it on to this tool. Art. Okay. Let me think about how to think about the. Okay, great. So this will tie into John Hersey's talk beautifully. And I'm going to narrow it to music because I'd like to tie it into his talk. So if you identify that music is a really important aspect of your life, right? So now it's one of your values. It becomes not a universal principle that you should treat music the way I'm going to suggest, but it becomes a personal principle of sorts for you because you love this thing and you need to make time for it in your life if your life is going to be the kind of life that you want it to be. But you're really busy. You're a coder and you work for a startup and you've got all sorts of time that you've got to put into that. And then you've also got your friends want to pull you to skiing and all sorts of different things. So you could use this. You could say, a principle in my life is going to be that I'm going to make serious time for music. And you could say I'm going to spend 10 hours a week really enjoying this art. And you make that a personal principle in your life. And if you find yourself violating the principle, again, the only punishment is that you're not living that life you tried to design. There may even be times in that case where something comes up and you can't put 10 hours in that week. If a parent dies and you have to go deal with that tragedy, all bets are off for the week. But in general, regular, everyday living, you can try to stick to that kind of a principle. So you can think of it in terms of this is now my moral high ground on this particular value. Initiation of force, great. So the initiation of force is evil, and it's not just evil, it's properly illegal. Why? Because it stops human beings from living as human beings. It stops us from living as the kind of beings that we are. We're a rational animal, which means that reason is our means of knowledge and our basic means of living. If we can't act on it, and to the extent that we are forbidden to act on it, we can't live as human beings. That's why if you put somebody in a cage and leave him there, he can't live as a human being. This is the reason that slavery is wrong, right? So it's a principle. So now the question is not just on the personal level, should you initiate force against people? That's just saying, well, obviously, no, criminals are wrong to do that. More importantly, because criminals violate rights far less than governments do, let's put governments up there. The proper purpose of government is to protect rights, not to initiate force against anybody, but only to use retaliatory force and only against those who initiate its use. That's sort of the full principle that you want up there. And then the question is our government initiating force to some extent? And if so, where and how are they doing that? And how can we rally politically to get them to repeal whatever laws have enabled that to happen? So the tool helps us to see there's a moral high ground, there are problems over here, and when you see a problem on that slope, what's the right direction? Up, right? The right direction is up onto the moral high ground. So you can do this literally with anything. Any thoughts to throw up there? Abortion. Okay, we'll do abortion. And then somebody said pride? Pride. Okay, we'll do abortion first and then pride. So we've got a principle that we need to work with on abortion. And you could take this either way. You could either, if you understand what rights are, you could put the principle of rights up there and then say, is the government upholding that principle given its laws, or are some of its laws regarding that principle over here on the slope? And I'm not going to dodge that question, but I'm going to focus on a more important question, and we'll put that up there. Either you understand a concept you're using or a principle that you're using and where it came from and why it's true, or you don't. Either or. And that's a principle. You either understand a given principle and why it's true, or you don't. If you don't understand what rights are, you should not be using that principle. You should not be saying people have a right to do this and people have no right to do that, because you don't know what you're talking about. It would be like being a mullah in her leftist days. She was using concepts and she didn't know what they meant. So you cannot get to the bottom of the abortion issue without answering the questions, what are rights, where do they come from, and how do we know it? I wrote an article on this very subject recently titled Abortion and the Questions We Must Answer, which gets more into that. So look into that. But that's an interesting way to look at this tool, right? You either understand a concept or you don't, or you either understand the principle or you don't. And if you don't, and you think it's important, like if you think the abortion debate is really important and you need to have a position on this, you ought to look into rights theory and figure out whether any of the theories of rights out there make sense, right? Do they come from God? Do they come from government? Do they come from nature we know not how? Or perhaps has somebody figured out what rights are and what facts of reality give rise to them? Spoiler, Ayn Rand figured it out. So you can run a search, Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights, or you can read her essay, Man's Rights, or The Nature of Government and Collectivized Rights. She's got several essays that get into this. But so every time the abortion debate comes up nowadays, my answer is, look, there's no point in talking to people about it if they don't know what rights are. Now, as soon as somebody says, well, I do know what rights are, great, let's get your concept of rights on the table and mine on the table so we know we're not talking past each other. Because we all know what a fetus is, and we all know what a woman is. Well, actually, come to think of it, I had forgotten it was 2022. Well, we at least all know what a fetus is, or has that come into contention as well? I don't know. Pride. Okay, so pride in the sort of Aristotelian and objectivist conception is moral ambitiousness. It's taking your life really seriously. I don't want to live a mediocre life. I want to live a robust, full, really awesome life. That's the kind. And there's no reason not to, like, why would you want less than that, right? You live once. Why not go for that? So moral ambitiousness up there on the moral high ground. My policy is, my personal principle, and this too I think is a universal principle, in order, if you want to flourish, you actually have to do this. So this isn't like the music, the personal music principle that we talked about earlier. This is genuinely a universal principle. If any human being wants to really make the most of his life and make it the best life it can be, the happiest, most value-filled life, he has to take his life really seriously. He's got to be morally ambitious. The ambitious part means I'm going to go after, I'm going to put real effort into the things that I go after. And the moral part, this is very important from an objectivist perspective, because if you get this wrong, it screws everything up. Moral in this context does not mean sacrificing for other people, because if you did that, you'd become Mother Teresa. If morally ambitious meant sacrifice a lot and be ambitious about it, you would literally, I mean, you could take the Mother Teresa route or you could do the Jesus route, but either way, it wouldn't be good for you. So what we mean by moral in this context, again, the Aristotelian / objectivist context here, is that moral means life-serving. I'm taking my life seriously. I'm going to take my mind seriously. I'm going to use my mind, as with as much alacrity as I possibly can to make my life wonderful. And if you do that, guess what happens? All things equal, obviously, tragedies can happen, catastrophes can happen to people. But if you do that, if you actually take your life seriously that way, your life is great. Now, let's say you move down the slope a little bit. You find yourself not being morally ambitious. You find yourself drifting a little bit. Well, that's not good for you. Again, nobody in the sky is going to come down and strike you down. And guess what? You can reverse course. There's no, you shouldn't freak out if you find yourself on that slope somewhere. I mean, you should heed it. You should recognize it and do something about it. But there's no point in freaking out because you know what you need to do. Move upward. Get back up there and take your life seriously. If you've been trying to learn a musical instrument and you had yourself set, I'm doing it every Saturday. I'm going to go play with the guys or whatever, and you start falling off on that. Well, maybe you need to reassess your hierarchy of values. Maybe that's no longer in your hierarchy in that way. But if it is still there, if it is still important to you, and you've sort of been letting it go, then you know what you need to do. Activate your mind, use your free will, and go after that value. So moral ambitiousness is just a beautiful sort of overarching principle of the objectivist ethics. It sort of says, always use your mind, never fake reality, always judge people, according to the facts, never defer to others and try to let them think for you. That's the virtue of independence. They can't do that, and you can't discover the truth by deferring to others. The only way you can discover the truth is activating your mind. So the virtue of pride sort of sums all of this stuff up and says, yes, live that way. And if you live less than that way, you're just living less awesomely than you could have. So this is the nature of this tool. Again, I call this principle as plateau. I don't know if that's the best name for it, but that's the going name at this point. And I've been using it for a long time. This kind of thinking came into my mind, by the way. There's a famous ice hockey player named Wayne Gretzky. And he's got this great line. I actually tweak it a little bit, so it's not, this is a paraphrase, but 100% of the shots you don't take won't go in. And I love that line because it's just true. As I told my wife back in the days when I was single, I heard that one day and I converted it into 100% of the girls you don't ask out won't go out with you. And it's true, right? 100% of the business plans you don't write won't be reviewed by investors. You can do anything you want with this principle, but what it is, it's an either or. Either you're going to take the action or you're not. If you don't take the action, if you don't ask the girl out, she's not going out with you. If you do, maybe she will, maybe she won't. Which of those odds is better, right? So I love this kind of thinking, and I'm still investigating it. I don't claim to have the final word on this. I teach a course on the elements of thinking and principles at Objective Standard Institute. This model and this, what we've talked about today, is just a portion of that course. We get into there also, how do you determine which principles are valid, and various nuances in that sphere. So I urge you to check out that course. We'll be teaching another round of that, I think, this winter. So get on our mailing list at Objective Standard Institute, and you'll hear about these kinds of things. I hope you have found this little tool helpful. I hope you'll use it, and thanks so much. And we do have time for Q&A.
Hi, quick question. How much qualification on context and other factors and so on before you stop calling it a principle and maybe start calling it a guideline or something else? Because I had an example that I was going to throw out earlier. For example, like assuming positive intent as it relates to effective communication in relationships, right? But you don't necessarily want to do that always. There's probably like some circumstances where you do and you don't want to. And like, if you start adding so much qualification, like it starts sounding less and less like a principle.
Yeah. So a principle really does need, in my view, it really needs to be a fundamental in a given sphere. So when I was loosely using the idea of principle, because this tool can be used with standing orders for yourself as well as principles. I was trying to not bring in another concept, but the standing order is basically an order that you give to yourself to always do this thing because it's going to help you live better. But to be genuinely a principle, I think we need to, that concept needs to be protected by not bleeding out into, well, everything's a principle. And I think a principle is a fundamental generalization that you use to guide your thinking and your action. And that is a broad and generic principle, just like the broad and generic concept of value, if you know, in Ayn Rand's Ethics. She says the value is that which one acts to gain or keep. And that would be that would include the bank robber goes after the free money in the bank. Well, it's a value to him in that context. So that's the difference between a general value and a morally validated value. But you can't morally validate values until you have discovered that life is the standard of value, and you use that initial definition, a value is that which one acts to gain or keep, to make that induction, right? That's how you that's one of the tools to get there. So both of these concepts are valid. Dr. Leonard Peikoff had a great course that he taught on this at one point. And the same thing applies to principles, and in exactly the same way. There's the general idea, it's general, fundamental generalization that you use to guide your thinking, and that's why God's word is the moral law, and you have to obey it, is a principle. It's a religious principle. In my view, it's completely false and completely arbitrary, but people do try to live by it, so that qualifies it as a principle, and it is general and fundamental. It's very fundamental, right? So then you get to valid principles, and you narrow it by saying, well, a valid principle is a fundamental truth. That means it's been proven. It's connected to reality through observation and logic, and that's a different kind of principle, but it's still a principle, and it's the kind of principle that can actually help you to keep your mind connected to reality, because it too came from reality. So where do you draw the line when it starts to get, when they start to thin out a bit, like, well, in order to have good friendships, you should keep in touch with your friends, right? Or something like that, just to throw something on the table, or keep communication lines open. I wouldn't call that a principle. I don't think that qualifies as a principle. It's also so obvious that I don't think it needs to be it doesn't need that kind of grounding. It's not obvious that you should always treat people in accordance with the available and relevant facts, and so the principle of justice. So that's really the fundamental there. Does that answer your question at all, or did I miss the ball?
I think it does, but maybe I can ask, do you have an off-the-cuff, idea about how we might formulate a principle around something like assuming positive intent? Like,
assuming positive intent from people. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I can do that fairly quickly. So you should always assume positive intent from people unless you have evidence to the contrary. And this is just the onus of proof principle. And so it's the same reason that we say that in a court of law, you should be treated as innocent until proven guilty. It doesn't mean you are innocent, but it means you're to be treated as innocent because the evidence hasn't been sussed out. If you don't have evidence that somebody is a bad person or has bad intention, you logically should give them the benefit of the doubt, because it's the difference between a positive and a negative. To assert the positive in this case would be to say he has bad intent. And the answer then would follow the question, how do you know it? Where's the evidence? There's either evidence for that or there isn't. Put that up there. There's either evidence or there isn't. And if you're treating it as though there's evidence when there's not, then you're erring. So positive intent always with individuals until you have evidence to the contrary.
Okay, thank you.
And that is a principle, I think, by the way. So I'm sorry I was long-winded and missed your question on the first effort. Yes, Carrie Ann.
I'm not sure whether you just answered this or not. I think I heard in your discussion that there are some types of principles that are not optional. Be rational. That's a lifelong thing. Other ones you seem to suggest that, well, maybe when you reevaluate your hierarchy of values, you can jettison certain principles. So how do you draw the bright line between optional versus non-optional principles? Could you clarify that distinction?
Yeah, great question. So difference between optional and non-optional principles, I would say optional and non-optional values is probably the easier way to start into this, so I will. First of all, there's no such thing as a moral principle that is mandatory, that you must do. There's no must apart from an if. So Rand wrote a beautiful essay, Causality versus Duty, in which she points out that there are no categorical imperatives. There's no such thing. This is another concept that has literally no referent in reality. Find a categorical imperative and evidence to support it. You could make it a lifelong project. You're not going to find one because they don't exist. There's no you must that is detached from an if you want. And this is crucial to the objectivist ethics. So if you want to live a beautiful life, then you need to activate your mind so that you can do that thing. And she uses the Spanish proverb, God said, take what you want and pay for it here, to point out that if you want something, you have to take the action to get it. In that same essay, she's got a beautiful one-line short story. She's so awesome at these kinds of things. So she says, there's an old black woman, and she's sitting there, and a man says to her, you've got to do this, or you've got to do that. And she looks up at him, and she says, mister, there's nothing I've got to do except die. And if you think about it, that's true. It's literally true that there is nothing that you have to do except die. Ethics there are no categorical imperatives. There's nothing you have to do. All properly formulated moral principles are, if you want to do this thing or have this thing, a great relationship, build a business, live a beautiful life, have children, whatever, then you have to take the actions necessary to get that thing and sustain that thing. If you want freedom, you have to work to sustain it. You know, the idea of the founders, you've got to engage in internal vigilance. So, to the issue of principle, no principles are mandatory when we're talking, okay. Oh. But optional versus not, okay. So there are universal moral principles, like you have to be rational if you want to live. And then there are principles that are optional, and I don't know that principles are optional. There are values that are optional. So you must produce in order to live. That's a principle, and that's why we have a virtue called productiveness. In order to live, you have to produce, because if you don't produce, you'll either die or you have to survive on other people's productiveness. So you would have to survive as a parasite. But within the overarching umbrella of productiveness, you can choose any career you want that's genuinely productive and that you enjoy doing, and that will serve to keep you sustain your life and give you the kind of joy that you want. But you can't do things like robbing banks and things that violate rights. So that sets it. So the optionality in values comes in that form. You know, you can be a dentist, you can be a botanist, you can be a fighter pilot, you can be all sorts of things that are great things to be. And that's where the optionality comes in. I don't think there are any optional principles. There are optional standing orders, which is why I think there's a significant distinction there. When the earlier questioner said, you know, what about music? And I said, well, you could put it this way. And there were other ways I could have answered the question about music, probably. That's the first one that came to mind, but we could probably have gone a bit deeper on that. Last question, thanks.
Could you talk a little about promiscuity? Because in two contexts, personal relationships and someone just going to visit a prostitute if it was legal.
Sure. Can I say a few words about promiscuity and possibly even prostitution? You know, I'm probably pretty close to I'm probably as close as you can get while being an objectivist, also being a hippie. So I'll start with that. I am really, really liberal in my thinking about social issues like sex and what people want to do, and even experimental drugs. Anybody have coffee this morning? Woo! Anybody have a cocktail tonight? Druggies, all of you. So I really, and when it comes to sex in particular, religion has so screwed up the way that human beings think about sex that it, and I'm going to write on this. I've got a pile of notes on this subject that I'm going to get into one day. And it really has messed up the way that people think about it. Sex is the most natural thing. Everybody here came here through an act of sex. It was the beginning of you. And it's this beautiful thing, and it's not just for procreation. It's for, cutting me out. God did that. He's like, you can't talk about that. It's not just for procreation. It's for enjoyment. It's for engaging and just becoming one with your lover. And it's really, really important. Now, should you sleep around? Is promiscuity good for you? I don't think so. I mean, I think at a certain time in life, and maybe even later in life again, if you're single and you're trying to figure out who you might want to engage in a relationship with, I'm all for sleeping with people while you're trying to figure that out, as long as you see that this person is genuinely of value, not just like, and so this brings me to prostitution or something like that. I think engaging in sex without any spiritual connection at all, so you're just kind of meat puppets in motion, I don't think that's good for the soul, because the sex is really an intimate, sort of a metaphysical act, right? You're getting into sort of this most what's the word I'm looking for? The most vulnerable, engagement imaginable. You're naked. You're together. You're kissing. You're inside one another, and to do that with someone you don't care about at all seems so foreign to my thinking. I just don't know why anyone would do it. But people do it, and there must be something psychologically going on that they get out of it. I would not rule out engaging with, there's one of my favorite TV shows, Boston Legal, has an episode where a guy sees a prostitute, not because he just wants to have sex, but because he's really, really awkward and he doesn't know how to deal with women. And so he goes to, she's not really a prostitute, she's a sex therapist is the way they put it in there. And she's helping him to try to become relaxed and learn how to engage with women in this environment. And that's really important. But by law, she would be a prostitute. So you have to be careful and make the divisions carefully here. As for being promiscuous just all over the place, I think it's a bad idea. But I also think that sex is so important that we need to take it really, really seriously and have as much of it as you possibly can with people you love or a person you love. So there's that. Thank you all.